We've been talking about how the British government has been controlling the American colonies and the reactions that the colonists are having to these different acts and laws. We left off with the Boston Massacre of 1770, where only 5 people were killed, but it is a sort of spark or a starting point for the American colonists to continue to be angered and upset about British involvement in the colonies. In 1772, the Gaspé Affair was when a British boat, it was a customs boat, it was trying to get after smugglers, because smuggling was a very popular occupation and very profitable at this time. This boat, the Gaspé, gets stuck. It sort of runs aground on a sandbar. And because it is a customs boat, it's customs officials, it's representing the different taxes that the American colonists are paying. The people, through the Sons of Liberty, end up kind of attacking this boat and burning it because they are so frustrated with the British government and with the customs officials and all of the taxes. What happens as a result of the Gaspé Affair is, the colonies are so upset, they don't really mind what the Sons of Liberty have done. So then England says maybe these people should be arrested and sent to England in order to get a fair trial. This really is frustrating because, especially with the case of the Boston Massacre, those British soldiers were tried in America by and were represented by John Adams, and they were given a fair trial. So this is now showing the American colonists, the British are definitely holding them to a double standard. And ultimately, the colonies realize they need to be united with each other in their response against the British. So they develop what are called committees of correspondence. This is first to just keep in contact about what is happening across the different colonies. Ultimately, it will be important in coordinating a response, coordinating the resistance of the revolution. The Townshend Acts, which were created in 1767 and had all of those different products that were being taxed, they were ended in 1773. The only thing that really it keeps a tax on is a tea tax. And they do this through a new act, the New Tea Act. And this changes a few things. It doesn't really change the price on tea for the colonists. It's actually a lower tax. But one thing is it is being enforced. The other thing is it allows the British East India Company to not have to pay import duties, to not have to pay taxes. So the citizens are paying the tax rather than the company. And it also allows the company to ship tea directly into the colonies. The colonists did not like this at all. They rebelled by purchasing smuggled tea, usually from the Dutch. And this ultimately will lead to the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. Again, this whole issue is not about necessarily the cost of tea, but the principle of who is being taxed for it. The Boston Tea Party is organized by the Sons of Liberty. They dress up like Indians, they paint their faces, they go to the boat that's sitting in the harbor, and they dump 342 chests of tea, which would be the equivalent of about 18.5 million tea bags. And this is all done in a very orderly process. The Sons of Liberty make sure that no one jumps in to get the tea. They are trying to send a message now, a little more violently than previous boycotts, but they're trying to send the message that they are not going to stand for this principle of being overtaxed without any way to speak up for their rights. It would have been the equivalent of at least $1 million. So this was a very expensive action on behalf of the colonists, but it certainly gets the point across. Now, the British government is going to react with a series of laws that the Americans refer to as the Intolerable Acts. They cannot believe that the British would do these things to them. The British call them the Coercive Acts. Their purpose is to force the American colonies to bend to imperial will, to force the colonies to follow the rules. And there are a series of different acts that are passed. We have the Boston Port Act. This closes the Boston port to all trade until the cost of dumping all of that tea is repaid. The problem is Boston, it is a port city, it depends on trade. So by closing the port, you are preventing the people of Boston from being able to make any money in order to pay back that cost to the British East India Company, who had been selling all of the tea. This is really upsetting, or seen as intolerable by the colonists, because it's punishing the few people, the few dozen men who perpetrated this act. It's punishing the whole colony rather than just those few men. And none of those people were ever given an opportunity to testify in their defense. So again, we see a lack of justice, or a double standard of justice on the part of the British. Then we have the Massachusetts Government Act. This gives all of the powers of the assembly, so the representatives chosen by the citizens, gives all of those powers to the governor, the person who has been appointed by the king. So now these are things like appointing judges who will be making decisions in court cases. It also limits town meetings to one time a year. And this was so important, especially up in these New England colonies, if you remember back to their Congregationalist heritage, where they would meet as a community, as a town, in order to find solutions. And now they're being prevented from doing that. Then we have the Administration of Justice Act. This says that anyone accused of a trial would be tried in England. This means that they probably would not get a fair trial. So there's a couple of issues here. For people committing crimes against the British government, they are not going to get a fair trial in England. For anyone committing crimes, any British people committing crimes in the colonies, by being sent back to England for a trial, they will probably get away with things. And George Washington called this the Murder Act because it would probably allow British officials and British soldiers to harass Americans and get away with it because they would just be sent back to England. Then we have the Quartering Act. We had a previous Quartering Act that said that towns might have to provide certain spaces like a town hall or, an old building where soldiers could live. But now this new act says that civilians, individual homes, might be forced to take soldiers into living with them. This actually is the least of the controversial acts because it seemed the most unlikely to happen. Then, not technically in the Intolerable Acts, is the Quebec Act. And we sort of lump it all together because it is done at the same time, and it is part of this angering of the colonists. Remember, after the French and Indian War, Canada becomes part of British territory, but there are still many French Canadians living there. With the Quebec Act, it says that Canada's borders can now extend, so it's taking over Indian territory, which the Americans had been preventing from settling in. It also gives more rights to the French Canadians in terms of religious freedom, in terms of political freedom, things that have not been granted or upheld for the British citizens living in America. They feel like they are being treated less than foreigners. They should be given English rights because they are English citizens. So the American colonists, they are going to respond to these acts by meeting at the Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress, it is called to respond to these issues. And their goal is not independence. Notice that we've been calling this a revolution all along, and it is quite revolutionary. They are not being given permission to meet by Parliament, but they are hoping to find compromise. They want to find a way to maintain the relationship with Great Britain and remain part of the empire. There are 12 colonies that send representatives. Georgia does not send a representative because they have some Indian issues that they are working on, and they want to maintain a entirely positive relationship with Britain so they can receive assistance in maintaining peace on the frontier with the Indians. Thomas Jefferson argues at the First Continental Congress that absolutely we will give allegiance, we will give loyalty to the king, but not Parliament. Those are men who are voted in and out. And so there is this way of trying to figure out, how do we move forward? And they decide that they need to send a message. They need to make it very clear to the British government and to King George III that they mean business. So they agree on a boycott. They agree that in a few months, starting on December 1st, 1774, they will boycott British goods. They will refuse to buy British goods. If the Intolerable Acts are not revoked within a year, then they would stop all exports as well. So throughout this whole time, they're refusing to buy British products, but they are continuing to maintain a trade relationship by selling things or putting things into the mercantilist system. They are now threatening that they will completely cut off all economic ties. This is not what they want. They want to stay a part of the empire if they can find compromise. In order to check up on this progress, they decide that they will meet again in 1775 if necessary. They're not sure if it's going to be necessary. They're hoping that the king responds positively. But if he doesn't, they will meet up again in Philadelphia in 1775. So throughout 1774 and early 1775, the king does not revoke the Intolerable Acts. While the Continental Congress is waiting for a response, hoping that the king responds positively, we have the situation at Lexington and Concord. There are lots of loyalists, meaning American civilians, who are living in the colonies. And the British government kind of expected that there were far more loyalists than there were patriots. So they are overestimating how popular the British government is in America. In April of 1775, arrest orders had been issued a few months earlier for some of the Sons of Liberty because they've been causing problems, they are wreaking havoc, they are targeting some of these loyalists and causing problems for them. But in particular, the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Back in January, it had been said they need to be arrested. And in April of 1775, it looks like both the army is going to head out of Boston to find these gentlemen and arrest them, but also they had heard that different militia groups, different civilian armies, had been stockpiling weapons and that there was quite a cache of weapons at Concord. And so the British Army will be setting out from Boston, going about the 25 miles or so to Concord. And this is when Paul Revere sets out, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. The midnight ride of Paul Revere is April 18th, 1775. And he's riding out to warn the militias, or as they could be called, Minutemen. Their job was alarm and muster. When you hear the alarm that the British are coming, your job is to muster at the town square with your weapons as fast as possible. And there is Paul Revere. He was a silversmith. He also is a Jack Black lookalike. Let me just go back to the map real quickly. So as the army is trying to go to Concord, As they come into Lexington, there are Minutemen waiting for them there, about 70, possibly 80 of these militiamen. They had heard the alarm, they mustered, they were ready. No one knows what happens. Both sides are saying, don't fire, don't fire. Someone fires. And this is the shot heard round the world. This is sort of the first real military action. It definitely shows that the British Army was not disciplined, but it also shows that the militia doesn't really know how to fight an enemy like this. However, it does show the British that these civilians, these patriots, they will fight back. So the militia at Lexington is defeated. The British Army continues on to Concord, where they are expecting to find a ton of stockpiled weapons. They find about 500 bullets. That's it. That had already been moved to another location. And then another group of militia attacks the Redcoats at Concord. Then they're tired. They've been going for 25 miles at this point. The British Army decides to retreat from Boston, sort of being harassed all the way by different patriot militias as they go back to Boston. So while we wouldn't necessarily consider this a battle, we now see that the revolution has truly begun. Military action has begun. And this was right around the same time as the Second Continental Congress. King George had not responded positively to the First Congress by revoking the Intolerable Acts. The boycott has been continuing. And so the Congress meets starting in May of 1775. Now that war has begun, sort of as symbolized by Lexington and Concord, it will be the job of the Congress to be the government, really, for these colonies. One of the first things they have to do is figure out money. Because they are no longer engaging in trade with Britain, the Continental Congress is going to print its own money. Now, one threat was definitely inflation, but it's better than nothing. So they print their own money. They also are going to send representatives to other countries, specifically France, and try to improve those relationships, hopefully to build alliances and get help from these other countries. Another issue is militarily, militias are the only organization existing. And so the Second Continental Congress decides to create a Continental Army. It's made up of the militias, specifically ones from Massachusetts, but it will have a commander-in-chief in now General George Washington. And he was chosen because everyone already knew him. Everyone was comfortable with him. Everyone had confidence in him because of his experience in the French and Indian War. Another thing the Second Continental Congress does is it writes the Olive Branch Petition. Although things have escalated now into conflict, this is a last-ditch effort by the Continental Congress to repair the relationship with King George. They send this letter, and they're saying, we've already started the bloodshed, but perhaps we can avoid war if you can repair the relationship, if you reduce some of the taxes and the trade restrictions, if you treat us as equal British citizens. King George's response to this is a resounding no. Instead, Parliament passes the American Prohibitory Act. And this essentially says that any American trading ship, so a merchant ship, a civilian ship, that it can be seized by the British Navy as a combatant, as an active enemy, even though it is completely civilian. And this really is an unofficial declaration of war, an all-out attack on American interests.